Welcome to the Mission Matters. The Mission Matters is a partnership between 1615 and Missio Nexus, who have a shared passion to mobilize God's people to be a part of His mission. The Mission Matters is hosted by Matthew Ellison, president of 1615, and Ted Esler, president of Missio Nexus. Make sure you like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And now, here are your hosts, Matthew Ellison and Ted Esler.
Well, hello and welcome once again to the Mission Matters podcast. I am Matthew Ellison. Sitting across from me, not literally, but virtually, is my good friend and co-host, Ted Esler. Ted, how's it going today?
Good. You could say sitting across the country, right?
That's right. I'm in New Mexico and you're in Florida.
Yep.
So, Ted, I'm going to break a podcast rule. I've done it several times. I like to color outside the lines, but I'm surprised we have 30 minutes of your time today, given that 2 weeks from now is the biggest event of the year for Missio Nexus. Tell us about it.
Well, we're excited because we have over 1,100 registrants, which we think is a record for us. There actually aren't good records going back too far, but at least since I've been around, it'll be our largest event. And we have the Church Mission Leaders Conference alongside the Standard Mission Leaders Conference. And we got a lot of virtual tickets sold here in the last week and a half. It's kind of amazing to us as well. So things are moving forward. We've had a few bumps in the road. Our MC just backed out.
Whoa.
You got to deal with these things. And we're short a few volunteers, but they'll come in before the conference. So it's exciting. We're looking forward to it.
Yeah, by the time this airs, the event will have already taken place.
Yeah.
That's why you're not supposed to do this. But if you are not, if you haven't been a part of the Missions Leaders Conference before, come in 2023. It really is an incredible gathering. I don't know if there's any place in the world where you can see a convergence of so many like-minded, like-hearted people. So if you can't, if you can't make 2022, if you're watching this and you didn't sign up, you're out of luck. But you were going to say something, Ted?
I was going to say that we have our theme for 2022, and I think it's going to be a good theme. All year long, we'll be focusing on it, and it is this. It is shift, rapid cultural transformation, and the gospel.
Great. And you meant 2023. You said 2022, just for
2023.
clarity.
Sorry, yeah. So
Excellent.
it's how we relate the Great Commission in the gospel in light of the rapid social change that's going on all around us.
I can't wait. And again, if you have not been, you need to find out about it. And we'll see you in 2023. So I want to start with a random question here, the softball question, and really excited about our guest. And when you hear the question, you're going to think I set this up, but I really didn't. I want to talk about our favorite missionary story / biography. And of course, I'll go first. It's Peace Child for me. And that'll make sense in a minute when given our guest. But I got rescued by Jesus when I was 19, a little older than that, 2021. But anyway, as a brand new believer, I got swept up into the mission of God immediately. And I just devoured missions books and biographies. And someone said, you must read Peace Child. And so I read Peace Child, and I happened to finish it when I was on an airplane, the last couple of chapters. And I was just overcome with emotion. The Spirit of God just moved, and I'm weeping on the airplane, literally, almost audible sighs. Yeah. And the people next to me thought something was wrong. And they said, are you okay? And I just showed them the book, and left it at that. I eventually became friends with Don Richardson. I was missions pastor at a church for about 10 years and led a short-term missions organization. He was one of our favorite speakers. But the first time we brought him in, I said, Don, I've got a bone to pick with you. I said, I was on an airplane reading your book, and I finished it and just burst into tears. So that was always an ongoing joke with us. But Ted, I know you're a good friend of Don's as well, was a good friend of Don's.
Yeah, well, that was a great book. Turning in Their Hearts was a great book. But when it comes to biographies, I'm going to tell you about one that very few people have read, but it's actually, I don't want to throw the author under the bus too much. It's actually not well written, but the story is so epic, it makes up for it. And it's a book called One Witness by Aggie Hurst. And it is a mind-blowing missionary story. It's kind of story that if I tell you that much, you give it away, and it doesn't have the same effect. It's being made into a movie. So it's a great one.
Yeah, no spoilers, Ted.
Okay, Steve, how about you?
So, I think Lords of the Earth, and that sounds a bit self-serving, but building on what you said, Matthew, Dad's second book is less known, but that's the one that pulled me to tears on multiple occasions. And it's the story of the martyrdom of two missionaries, Spandale and Phil Masters, in the highlands of New Guinea. And then a plane crash where a good friend of mine named Paul Newman and his family, he lost his three siblings and his parents in that plane crash. He was the only survivor. He made his way out through the broken rear part of the plane and started heading up to the very village that had killed these two missionaries a short time earlier. And that whole story and book is just one of the sagas of God's redemptive. There's thriving churches in that in that tribe and in that valley today, but it was at great cost.
Well, I mean, those are all three of those attest to Don's impact and influence. And our guest today is Don's son, Steve Richardson, the president of Pioneers USA, and a longtime friend. And you have recently written your own book. What's the title?
Here it is. Is the commission still great? This is the pre-publication printout. Got a few copies of this, and I'm really excited about it. It's coming out here in October.
So, Steve, I've heard you talk about this project in the past. What motivated you to write this particular book? Why this topic?
So, quite a few years ago, I was speaking at a church outside Philadelphia, and I was sharing some of the amazing things that God is doing around the world. And an elderly lady came up to me after the service. She literally had tears on her cheeks, and she said, I've been giving and praying faithfully for years and years. And it was like God spoke to me and said, it hasn't been for naught. I've been working around the world. And she said, I've just been kind of not knowing much, doing it by faith. And I thought to myself, if she's being faithful with her giving and her prayers, but not sensing, what the impact was, I wonder how many people are in that boat. And then I thought, how many other perceptions are there about the Great Commission, about missions, that may be a little off or maybe incomplete, and therefore people are not as motivated for their involvement in the Great Commission as they could otherwise be. So that launched me on a bit of a collection. I started having conversations with different people and asking questions. What do you think people's perception of missions is? And how might it not align with biblical teaching and today's realities? And I started collecting these, and they ended up becoming the basis. I've got 8 of these. It's not by any means the whole list of misperceptions that people would have, but it's a good start, and it's a good conversation starter, I think.
So, Steve, one of the things I love to do when I'm working with the church is to create a bit of disequilibrium. And I don't want them to fall over, but I want to create tension in the heart and mind of people that I'm talking to about missions, half-truths, and assumptions, because I want them to appraise, is my understanding about missions and these ideas driven by scriptures or by something else? And so you address these 8 myths, and I think it creates some needed disequilibrium in a very gracious way. Mm-hmm. But maybe you could highlight a couple of those myths for us.
Yeah, so one of them, for example, is what I call the side salad syndrome, where missions, it's a good thing, but it's after you've had the main course, which has more to do with your personal sanctification and becoming a better person. And so it's really a missionless, in some ways, a missionless Christianity. I think that quite a few people live as if nothing that important happened between the resurrection and the ascension. And, surveys have borne this out. It's like over half of churchgoers don't even know what the Great Commission is, and something like another 38% have a vague notion of it, but couldn't really tell you, much less tell you that it comes in kind of 5 different versions in the 4 Gospels and in Acts, with 5 different emphases and a lot of important, basically we got our marching orders there. after the resurrection and before Jesus ascended. And so many people live as if, and that's only part of the story. It's the whole biblical narrative. So that's one. I think another one is that missions is harmful. There's kind of I think you've had a podcast recently about missions, feeling to some people colonial and imperialistic. Is this kind of a vestige of Western imperialism? When in fact, most missionaries are not from the West, and most missionaries aren't going to traditional societies like they once were. They're going to the teeming cities of the world. But here's one thought, Matt and Ted, is that in all my travels in traditional cultures, meeting thousands of people in all kinds of different cultural contexts, I've never had one person come up to me and say, I wish the missionaries had never come. But I've had thousands of people celebrating and dancing and crying and reenacting the advent of the gospel, the arrival of the gospel. And I have of course, had a front row seat to that among the Sawi people growing up there in New Guinea. So missions is harmful. It's another one. Some people think missions is failing. We're not really making progress. The global population is growing faster than the progress of the gospel, when in fact, if you narrow the definition of Christianity to evangelicals and Bible-believing Christ followers, evangelicals are multiplying at about 2.6% rate every year, and the world population is slowing down. I think it's at about 1% now. So God is doing great things around the world, and missions is not failing. And it never has so much been accomplished by so few with so little over so many generations of sustained effort. And it's definitely a God honoring and Herculean task.
I'd be curious, just a few thoughts. Why do you think so? I mean, I obviously agree with your myths, that these are myths, or things I've heard for sure. Why is the reality so different than what the average believer? I mean, are we not doing our jobs? What do you think contributes to this fog in the pew?
I do think part of it is that we're not doing our jobs. I would have to say, I feel like in our theology, there needs to be a rediscovery of the missionhood of the believer and not just a priesthood of the believer. So frankly, in our training programs and institutions, there's a blind spot. And I don't think that's unique to this chapter of history. I think for much of church history, the idea of the Great Commission and cross-cultural, there was a time when they thought that if there were just a few Christians on every continent, the task had been accomplished. There were seasons when they thought that the Great Commission was only given to the apostles, the 11. I suspect when Jesus gave the Great Commission, that middle time on the mountain in Galilee, that's possibly when the 500 disciples were there. So anyway, but I think too, Ted, there's spiritual warfare. I mean, if the main thing happening in the world today is that the gospel of the kingdom is being preached to all the nations, to all the cultures of the world, then the enemy's number one goal is going to be to obstruct that process, to create a distraction, discouragement. And the best way to do that is disinformation. Like, there's this Chinese philosopher, strategist from the 4th century BC, who said the supreme art of war is to subdue the enemy without fighting. So if the devil can subdue his enemy without even actually having to fight a war on, his territory, so to speak, culturally speaking, by disenfranchising the disciples, today's disciples, from their mission in the world, then he's won the battle before he's even fighting. So disinformation, all kinds of stuff. Yeah.
I think you bring up something so important, Steve, and that is there's something insidious at work here. Something evil is going on. If the meta narrative, the master story, as you mentioned, it's so obvious, when you see it in scripture, and yet so many believers, their eyes are blinded to it. They just don't see it. And that's because and I'm not being harsh here, but pastors aren't communicating the plot line. We focused on the subplots. We focus on the smaller stories, but we miss the larger picture. And I just think that's an important reminder, because the weapons we fight with are not of this world. This is a war that will be won with prayer. And of course, when Jesus talked about the harvest being plentiful, what did he say? Ask the Father for more laborers to be sent into the harvest. So I appreciate that reminder, because I think we can look at this very practically, pragmatically, and we should, but we have to remember this is a supernatural work that we're involved in, and we need to combat those forces of darkness with prayer. So Steve, you state in your book that some of these myths have a kernel of truth to them. Maybe you could give an example of how a good idea can become imbalanced or incomplete.
So take the idea that Western, I think this is related to the prior question as well, that missions is obsolete. I had a very committed believer here visiting not too long ago who said, he just couldn't believe it. He said, "Is this still a thing?" And he's active, he's committed, he's giving in other arenas. And it's like, are there actually groups that are just like totally focused on seeing the gospel going out to other nations and other cultures? And he was just like, tingles, went out to dinner together. And so I think it's like, the kernel of truth is, number one, as we were saying, missions has been incredibly successful in so many ways. Korea was considered impenetrable, 200 years ago, and today there's 7,000 churches in Seoul alone. By the way, there's at least 6 Persian Iranian churches there as well. You take China and the 100+ million people who were there. Robert Morrison back in the early 1980s, when he finished, I've heard he had 3 or 4 converts, but he translated the Bible. So with all this news, and then we have all these issues locally, and it feels like the West is paganizing. So then we're like, it's really challenging to keep lifting our eyes to the rest of the world, beyond even the issues that are happening socially and politically and culturally here in the US. So, and you're obviously the expert, Matt, on everything is missions. I mean, there's a kernel of truth. Everything is part of the mission of God. Mm-hmm. It all relates. It's all interconnected. It's never just one part of what God has planned for us. It's the whole picture. But then if you start confusing words and you start losing definitions of what we mean, and I call that inflation, missiological terminology inflation, and suddenly the cross-cultural church planting and the discipleship that needs to be happening, and in which there are still so many needs around the world, that's a whole nother sermon, gets lost.
I think part of what's going on now too is it's kind of like, I call it's anachronistic judgment. In other words, we sit at this point in history, we look back, there are terrible things that happened in the past, and there's judgment about that. Mm-hmm. And it flavors everything that happens now. For example, we think of missionaries of the previous era as being colonialistic. So I recently was talking to somebody, they'd been overseas, and I said, "So did you spread globalism when you were over there?" And they're like, "What do you mean?" I said, "Well, this is the globalized age, right? So if you're going cross-culturally, you must be like a globalizer when you're going." And of course, that's not their intent, that's not their thought, that's not their thinking. Yet we judge somebody like William Carey, who went in opposition to his own government to India as a colonizer. And it's just the furthest thing from the truth.
Often it was the missionaries who were the protectors, the most sympathetic parties. Mm-hmm. And sometimes, as you know, part of the motivation of people like David Livingstone and others was to actually help stop the intertribal warfare and all the other things that were going on. So yeah, I agree. We tend to look through our own lenses at other parts of the world without gathering empathy really from history as well as from people in those places.
Yeah, and certainly there's been some bad missionaries, there's been some bad actors, but by and large, the missionary endeavor has brought good to society. We've referenced the study many times on this podcast, I think, but the Woodbury study really addresses that the good that these proselytizing missionaries have done, those who are sharing the gospel.
Yeah, if you want to see a thriving democracy somewhere in the world, get in a time machine and take a Protestant missionary to that country back in the 1900s.
It's good.
Let's take this down into Matthew's specialty here. How about in a local church? Is missions in competition for budget dollars? Is it augmenting? What did you come up with in the area of the local church?
Well, the big picture, I didn't get into a lot of detail on that, but the big picture in my view is that it's a win-win. And I think too often we look at it as a win-lose. And the obviously difficult decisions always have to be made, as it relates to budget and so forth. But this might sound a bit counterintuitive, but I love thinking in terms of super spreader churches. And I've been a part of some of these, and they have been hugely impactful in missions over decades. And I'm not talking about a virus, obviously. I'm talking about the gospel. And these super spreader churches have had leaders, senior pastors, lead pastors, elders who were passionate about the Great Commission and the big picture. And my observation is that the golden age in each of these churches, and you could kind of name so many of them, in terms of both local as well as global impact, was when they were lifting their eyes to the harvest, the big picture. And the better you have the big picture, the more motivated you are for the local picture as well. That's my theory. And I think if you only emphasize this, the local, and one of the big tensions is, these days, and I tackle this from several angles in the book, is the whole issue of sending Westerners. That's where a lot of the rub is, the cost and so forth. But I really think it's still a key part of what we need to be doing.
So, in working with churches, I see exactly what you're talking about, Steve. I mean, the churches that I've had the privilege of coming alongside that have a passion for the nations, they're the most active domestically. They're the most active in the soup kitchens, among the homeless. They're addressing the needs of widows and, all of the societal problems that we have. But it's interesting, those that I've encountered that push back, like, why would we go over there? There's so many needs right here. Again, this is anecdotal, but I don't see those churches actively engaging in their communities. It's kind of ironic, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. And, ultimately, every question gets back to what's biblical.
Yeah.
And are we embracing the whole, divine will of God? And I think as long as one of my goals with this book is to generate the conversations. I don't expect people to agree with me on all these topics, and that's fine. But we're going to have this website, to go with the book. And one of my hopes is to generate a lot of small groups in churches and to help equip, pastors and mission committee people, to give them some tools to generate those conversations so that the people of God can wrestle with these issues honestly, share their open feelings about short-term missions or whatever it is. And if they can come out with that, with a clearer picture of their part in God's picture, then we'll have accomplished our mission here.
David Penman, he was Archbishop in New Zealand, and he has a quote that I've used for years. I just love it. And he says, no local church can afford to go without the nourishment and encouragement that will come to it by sending its best people to the mission field. And so, Ted, you ask what happens when a church embraces this? What does it really look like? And I think health. When a church aligns itself with the heart of God, there's health and vitality that come to the church. But there's also, we talked about opposition. This is warfare. This is cosmic warfare. Let's talk about that a little bit, Steve. Can a church that steps up its game, so to speak, and getting the gospel to the nations, would you imagine they can anticipate an intensified spiritual warfare?
Yeah, and I've seen it in some of our own closely connected churches. And that just plays along with, if you're a threat to the kingdom of darkness, you're going to become more and more of a target. But, related to this whole combined picture of the last question and this one, just take the church in Antioch. They gave what you could call their best, right? Through prayer and through guidance. I don't think the church in Antioch ended up suffering long-term as a result. My sense would be from subsequent passages there in the book of Acts that the church of Antioch became more and more of a launching pad for a whole new dramatic chapter in so many different cultures as a result of their sacrificial obedience and giving their best. So, and the spiritual warfare was great, sure. Division, potential for division, misunderstanding, all kinds of stuff.
Well, Steve, I know you can say Amazon.com, but I heard you say you're doing a website for the book. How can people get more information about the book?
So pioneers.org/myths will be a whole series. I'll be doing a few short videos. Actually, I already done them. And it'll give groups prompters and material and fodder. We've got the questions, obviously, in the book, but we've got more material on that website and Barnes and Noble. And yeah, I would just encourage you to take advantage of this resource that I think will be a blessing to many churches.
So just to be clear, it's set up in a group study format?
Yeah, I mean, individuals are going to benefit tremendously, but I'd love to see a multiplier effect. And I think the greatest value will come from discussions among people. It can be like 3 or 4 people. It can be a small group in a church that just wants to take 8 to 10 weeks and work through this. And a fantastic tool, I believe, for helping to sharpen people's thinking in terms of the big picture.
All right.
Yeah. Thank you,
That's
Ted.
great. So this is a portion of the show where I'm going to kick it over to Ted. But before I do that, I have to circle back to Antioch. Okay, I can't resist this, but Acts 14:27. Okay, they come back from their first missionary journey. You gentlemen know the passage. It says they gathered the church and they rehearsed the work of the Spirit and how the door of faith had been opened to the Gentiles. What a service that must have been, brothers. I mean, talk about opposition. Just read Acts 13:1 to 14:27. There was warfare, but there was these courageous stories of the gospel's advance and this narrative of the work of the Spirit. And I've often asked the question, had they not sent their best to engage the nations, they would have had no war stories to recount. And our churches are poor because they have no war stories. So I would say get in the game, read this book. There's some myths out there, and I think they're well-intended sometimes, but they have unintended consequences. So I hope you'll pick up Steve's book. I was really glad to read it and endorse it myself. So Ted, this is the time of the show where I ask you, what is it that you like?
All right. Well, I'm going to share a gadget with you today, Matthew. And if you travel much, this would be a gadget you might be very interested in getting. I recently got myself a small 100-watt wall charger. It came with a couple of USB-C ports and a couple of USB ports. The key there is 100-watt. You want a big one that it's actually not a big device. It's just a little, it looks like a regular little wall wart, but it can do all the charging for you on a trip. So I have a Lenovo laptop and I can plug it into the USB-C port at 100 watts. And in a couple hours, it's charged up. It charges the phone faster than anything else I've ever used before. So if you need a quick charge when you're on a trip, you can use this thing and you get up to speed in no time. And I've kind of just relied on whatever standard charges come with devices, like most of us, I'm sure. This one here is really awesome because now I can bring one charger. I can charge all my devices, cutting down on the bag and the weight and everything else while still getting the charging. So doesn't matter which brand really. I'd get a multi-port, probably 4 ports, because you'll have a lot of stuff plugged in at once. Go out and get yourself a 100-watt charger.
There it is, something Ted likes. Hey, Steve, thanks for being here. Ted, I will see you in Orlando in 2 weeks. Steve, will I see you there as well?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to it as well.
Great. And again, by the time you folks watch this, you'll have missed 2022. But something I like is the Missions Leaders Conference. So join us in 2023. Steve, thanks for being with us.
Thanks, Steve.
A pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Before you go, would you visit our hosts' websites? There you will find a wealth of interesting and challenging information about the state of the Great Commission. They are 1615.org and missiononexus.org. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss one. Mission Matters is presented through a partnership between 1615 Missions Coaching and Missio Nexus.